Welcome to the Deep Dive. Our mission here is simple. Take the stack of sources on history's most towering figures, distill the essential knowledge, and deliver it to you, the learner, in one fascinating conversation.
And today, we are tackling a giant, really the giant of literature, arguably the fundamental architect of the modern English language itself, William Shakespeare.
Right. Universally acknowledged, isn't he? Greatest writer in English, world's preeminent dramatist, England's national poet.
Often called the Bard of Avon, yeah. That title alone tells you something.
We have so much ground to cover today. Our deep dive is really focused on tracing the established facts of his life, what we actually know.
And analyzing that revolutionary evolution of his writing style, we can sort of track it across three major creative phases.
Definitely. And crucially, we need to unpack those enduring historical controversies and, well, the gaps, the things that still persist centuries after his death.
The sheer scale of his output is just astounding. It's essential context, really, for understanding his global impact, his extant works. What is it, something like 39 plays?
Yeah, 39 plays, 154 sonnets, 3 long narrative poems, and various other verses. It's incredible.
And when we talk about global influence, you have to consider this staggering fact. His plays have been translated into every major living language.
Over 80, I read, including constructed ones like Esperanto and even Klingon.
Klingon, that says it all, doesn't it? And they're performed more often than those of any other playwright worldwide. He is, simply put, the single most influential writer in the Western canon, period.
Okay, so let's unpack this first. Let's leave the bright lights of London for a moment and go back to where it all began. Stratford-upon-Avon, Warwickshire, a provincial market town.
That's right. Shakespeare was born and raised there, and his background was, well, solid, if not exceptionally privileged. He wasn't aristocracy.
But his family did have some local distinction.
Oh, yeah. His father, John Shakespeare, was a successful glover, dealt in hides too, but more importantly, he served as an alderman, and at one point, bailiff.
Which was basically the town's chief magistrate, right?
Exactly. So William grew up in an environment where, civic duty and commercial success were key components of life, not just farming.
And his mother, Mary Arden.
She came from an affluent landowning family, so that sort of tied him to the local gentry, a step up maybe.
And biographers, they always loved that neat historical symmetry around his birth and death dates.
Ah, yes. The date paradox. He was baptized on April 26, 1564, but his birth date is traditionally observed on April 23rd, which is St. George's Day.
And the same day he died in 1616.
Exactly. The 23rd of April is an observance scholars kind of lean into, mostly because of that symmetry, but the actual birth record doesn't survive, just the baptism.
And in that era, baptism usually followed birth pretty quickly.
Yeah, typically 3 days or so after birth, which makes the 23rd a very reasonable guess, but it's not confirmed. Just tradition.
Okay, now, his education. This is another area where we don't have hard records, but the consensus is he was extensively educated locally. What does that really tell us about the foundation for everything that came later?
It tells us he didn't need Oxford or Cambridge to become the bard, basically. He likely attended the King's New School right there in Stratford.
A free grammar school.
Yes, mandated by royal decree and following a really rigorous curriculum. This wasn't just, learning your ABCs.
No, it was intensive Latin, wasn't it?
Oh, very much so. Latin grammar, rhetoric, classical authors like Ovid, Seneca, Cicero. The boys would have been translating constantly, learning how to construct formal arguments, being exposed to sophisticated poetic models. It really provides the perfect explanation for all those classical and historical allusions that just saturate his later work.
Right, you don't need a university library if you've got Ovid drilled into you from a young age.
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay, so the personal drama seems to kick in when he's just 18. He marries Anne Hathaway.
Who is 8 years his senior, which was a bit unusual, maybe?
And the circumstances are always described as suggesting haste. Why? What's the actual evidence beyond just, speculation?
Well, the evidence lies in the legal paperwork, essentially. The license was issued by the Consistency Court of the Diocese of Worcester, which wasn't the standard route.
Okay.
And more crucially, the marriage bans, that's the public notice of intent to marry, they were read only once instead of the usual 3 Sundays.
Cutting corners.
Exactly. Reducing that notification period was a specific, deliberate action, and it was often taken when there was urgency involved, usually a pregnancy that needed to be legitimized before the birth.
And that urgency seems immediately confirmed, doesn't it? Their first child, Susanna, was born only 6 months later.
May 1583. Yeah, 6 months is pretty definitive. It's part of that human drama that sometimes gets, glossed over when we just focus on the poetry.
Sure. And after Susanna, they had twins.
Hamnet and Judith, born in 1585.
Yeah.
And tragically, Hamnet died when he was just 11 in 1596.
Right in the middle of Shakespeare's most productive period.
Absolutely. That loss must have been profound, and you can certainly argue it colored the works that followed, especially perhaps the writing of Hamlet not long after.
Okay, so the period immediately following the birth of the twins, from about 1585 until he suddenly pops up in London print in 1592. That's the 7-year gap.
That's the famous chasm scholars call the lost years.
Lost years. It sounds so dramatic.
Well, it is a fascinating historical blank canvas, precisely because the official records just dry up completely for 7 years.
Which naturally means people fill in the blanks.
Oh, inevitably. This lack of documentation gave rise to all sorts of colorful, but largely unsubstantiated legends that have become part of the whole Shakespeare mythos.
Let's touch on a few of those. The big one is that he had to flee Stratford because he was in trouble with the law.
Yeah, the deer poaching story. This is the most famous anecdote, really. It was recounted by Nicholas Rowe, who was Shakespeare's first formal biographer back in the early 18th century.
So quite a bit later.
Oh, yes. The story claims Shakespeare was involved in poaching deer on the estate of a local bigwig, Sir Thomas Lucy. And apparently the prosecution was so severe that Shakespeare legged it to London.
And supposedly took revenge by writing a nasty poem about Lucy.
A scurrilous ballad, yes. It's a great story, isn't it? Fits that idea of the young, rebellious poet sticking it to the establishment, but factually, totally unproven.
Right. What about his supposed first job in London? The horse-minding story.
Yeah. Another 18th century tale suggested he started right at the bottom, on the fringes of the theater world. Not as an actor or writer, but literally minding the horses of the wealthy theater patrons outside the playhouses.
Plausible, I suppose.
Entirely plausible as a starting point for, an unknown young man trying to get a foothold. But again, zero contemporary evidence to confirm it. Just hearsay.
And then there's the more sort of professional speculation, the idea he might have been a schoolmaster.
That comes from a note by the antiquarian John Aubrey, who claimed Shakespeare worked as a country schoolmaster during this period.
Which led to that whole complicated William Shakespeare theory.
Exactly. In the 20th century, scholars picked up on Aubrey's note and connected it to a Lancashire landowner, Alexander Houghton. Houghton was a known Catholic recusant, and his 1581 will mentioned a William Shakespeare.
Okay.
So the theory was maybe our William Shakespeare used the name Shakespeare and was employed as a schoolmaster or maybe even an actor within the Houghton household, which could also subtly, link him to Catholic sympathies during that hidden period.
But the big problem is the name, right?
The reality is Shakespeare was a relatively common name in Lancashire back then. It's suggestive, it's intriguing, but
it's not proof.
Not even close. We have to be really clear. These stories, they provide context for the kind of life he might have lived, the sort of things young men did, but they are all hearsay collected decades, sometimes centuries after his death. Those 7 years, they remain largely a historical mystery.
Which makes his sudden, explosive arrival in the London scene all the more dramatic, really.
Exactly. And his arrival isn't marked by some triumphant debut playbill. No, it's marked by a really vicious literary attack in 1592.
Right. This is the earliest surviving mention of him in print, from Robert Greene.
That's the one. From Greene's rival playwright in his pamphlet Groat's Worth of Wit, which was actually published just after Greene died.
Well, Greene's attack is crucial, isn't it? Because it proves Shakespeare was already active and, well, successful enough to make rivals really jealous.
Vitally important. Greene doesn't even use his name, does he? But he uses that unmistakable pun, calling him the only Shake seen in a country. There's no doubt who he means.
And the source of Greene's bitterness seems pretty clear. Class snobbery and Shakespeare's perceived lack of a formal university education.
Oh, absolutely. Greene had a Master of Arts from Cambridge. He clearly resented this guy, Shakespeare, achieving success without that university background. He called him an upstart crow, beautified with our feathers.
Suggesting he was just copying or stealing from supposedly superior writers.
Precisely. Taking the best bits from the university wits, as they were known. But the most pointed insult, the real kicker, was calling him Johannes Factotum.
Which means jack of all trades.
Yes, but it wasn't the compliment we might think of today, like being versatile. Greene was basically accusing Shakespeare of being an ambitious, arrogant tinkerer. Someone trying his hand at everything, comedy, tragedy, history, and daring to think he could match the work of the classically trained guys like himself, Thomas Nash, Christopher Marlowe.
The subtext is basically, you're just a common actor trying to write like your betters.
That's exactly the subtext. Stay in your lane, essentially.
But despite Green Sour Grapes, Shakespeare's career just took off, didn't it? By 1594, he wasn't just writing plays, he became a fundamental part of the business structure of his acting company.
The Lord Chamberlain's men, yes. And this is probably the single most important factor in explaining his later financial success. He became a sharer.
A part owner.
A part owner, exactly. Most playwrights back then were just paid a one-time fee for a script, which meant they had to constantly churn out new stuff just to survive.
A pretty precarious living.
Very. But as a sharer, Shakespeare got a cut of the company's profits, not just a playwright's fee. And importantly, he'd get profits from revivals of his older hits, too.
So he was literally invested in the company's success. That structure insulated him from that constant grind of the single payment system.
Completely. And it made him wealthy. Wealthy enough to make significant investments back in his hometown.
Right, like buying new place in Stratford in 1597.
Which was the second largest house in the whole town. Think about that. This demonstrates serious accumulated wealth, far beyond what a typical playwright could manage.
Bigger than the house he grew up in.
Much bigger. And later, in 1605, he further diversified his income by investing in a share of the parish tithes, basically a kind of real estate investment generating steady income.
This dual existence is just fascinating. He's at the absolute cultural core of London theater, writing these masterpieces, but he's also constantly maintaining and investing in his Stratford life, like a successful merchant.
He had remarkable business acumen. And it extended to the theater infrastructure itself, too.
The Globe Theater.
Yes.
Yeah.
He was one of the partners who funded and built the iconic Globe in 1599. And later, when the company needed a winter venue, they were renamed the King's Men after getting a royal patent from James I in 1603.
Right, King James.
They took over the Blackfriars Indoor Theater in 1608. He wasn't just an author, he was effectively a theatrical mogul, a producer, an investor.
And even with all this writing and managing the business side, he apparently never stopped acting.
Seems not. He continued to perform. We see his name in the cast list for plays written by his rivals, including Ben Jonson's Every Man in His Humor and Sejanus' His Fall.
Which tells us he remained a physical presence in the company, known to his peers as an actor too.
Definitely. Still part of the troupe.
And we have that lovely little anecdote, though maybe apocryphal, that he played the ghost of Hamlet's father.
Yeah, that tradition was passed down by early biographers. It's fitting, isn't it? The greatest writer, perhaps playing one of the most atmospheric, short, but incredibly impactful roles in his own masterpiece, gives you a sense of his connection to the stagecraft.
It does. We should also probably mention collaboration, right?
Mm-hmm.
The idea of the lone genius wasn't quite the norm then.
No, collaboration was very common for playwrights, especially later in their careers. And Shakespeare definitely worked with others. The evidence points strongly to him working with John Fletcher, particularly late in his career.
On plays like Henry VIII.
Henry VIII and the Two Noble Kinsmen, yes. Those are generally accepted as collaborations, likely with Fletcher.
Okay, so fast forward a bit. Around 1613, Shakespeare seems to have retired, moved back to Stratford full-time. This was before the Globe actually burned down later that year.
Yes, the timing suggests he was already stepping back before the fire. And retirement from all work was pretty uncommon then for someone of his age and status, still relatively young.
So why would he step away? He was wealthy, successful.
Well, if you look at the context of his working life in London, one major factor becomes tragically clear: the bubonic plague.
Ah, the theater closures.
Exactly. Between just May 1603 and February 1610, that's less than 7 years, London's public playhouses were forced to close for over 60 months due to recurring plague outbreaks.
60 months. That's 5 full years out of 7.
Imagine trying to run a profitable theater company under those conditions, the constant uncertainty, the massive financial drain, not to mention the very real risk of infection. It likely drove him towards the relative safety and stability of his big house and investments back in Stratford.
Makes perfect sense. Okay, so he dies on April 23rd, 1616, aged 52, that traditional birthday date again. What's intriguing is that he signed his will just a month before and apparently described himself as being in perfect health.
Yeah, the will suggests he wasn't anticipating imminent death. We have no confirmed contemporary source for the actual cause. But, as always with Shakespeare,
The speculation is more colorful.
much more colorful. About half a century later, John Ward, who was the vicar of Stratford at the time, wrote down the local legend.
The merry meeting.
That's the one. The story goes that Shakespeare died of a fever he contracted after a merry meeting, drinking too hard with his literary pals Ben Jonson and Michael Drayton.
A rather bohemian end for the man who became the respectable Stratford property owner.
It is, isn't it? Whether it's true or not, who knows? But it's the story that stuck.
His legal legacy is mostly contained in that will. He left the bulk of his pretty sizable estate to his elder daughter, Susanna.
Right. And sadly, his direct line actually ended not too long after. His granddaughter, Susanna's daughter, Elizabeth Barnard, died without any children in 1670, so no direct descendants after that.
But the most famous and endlessly debated part of that will is the specific bequest to his wife, Anne.
Item, I give unto my wife my second best bed with the furniture. That specific line.
My second best bed. It sounds like a snub, doesn't it? Has it always been interpreted that way?
It's launched centuries of academic and popular debate. Was it a calculated insult or maybe a gesture of profound affection?
How could it be affection?
Well, the argument for it being an insult suggests that Anne, as the widow, was automatically entitled by law to 1/3 of his estate anyway, which would typically include the best bed in the house. So specifically, leaving her only the second best bed could be seen as a pointed slight, maybe hinting their relationship was strained.
Okay, that makes sense. What's the counter-argument?
The opposing view, which is actually quite popular now, argues that the best bed in a prosperous household was often kept in the guest chamber, reserved for honored visitors.
Ah, like the formal parlor furniture.
Exactly, whereas the second best bed would have been the actual marital bed, the one used by the couple, the intimate one, rich with sentimental meaning.
So maybe it was a meaningful gift.
It's possible. The ambiguity is perfect, isn't it? It ensures the debate just keeps going, reflecting that wider uncertainty we have about their personal relationship.
Fascinating. Regardless of Anne's inheritance, his final resting place was carefully secured, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Buried in the chancel of Holy Trinity Church in Stratford.
Prime position, yes. And his epitaph is surely one of the most famous curses in all of literature.
Designed to stop anyone moving his bones.
Explicitly. It's a powerful 4-line appeal, carved right into the stone slab over his grave. It reads, "Good friend, for eye's sake forbear, to dig the DVST enclosed here, lest ye a man ye spares these stones, and serverse be he moves my bones."
It's worked, apparently.
It seems to have. Even during extensive church restorations in the 21st century, they used ground-penetrating radar and everything, but his grave itself was carefully left untouched. Nobody wanted to risk that curse.
Okay, let's move now from the man himself to his monumental literary output. And the first thing we run into is a pretty significant challenge, figuring out what he actually wrote down. Textual instability.
It's incredible, isn't it? Hard to imagine now, the greatest writer in the language maybe not overseeing the definitive publication of his own works.
So the closest we get to a definitive text is posthumous.
Yes, the famous First Folio of 1623, published 7 years after his death by his fellow actors John Heminges and Henry Condell.
Friends and colleagues from the King's Men.
Exactly, and this was a monumental effort, really a labor of love and memory. It contained 36 plays, and crucially, 18 of those had never been printed before. Without the folio, we might have lost works like Macbeth, Twelfth Night, Julius Caesar.
Unthinkable. But before the folio, many plays only existed in these quarto editions. Flimsy little books.
That's right. Quarto editions, often printed quite haphazardly during his lifetime. And these are the source of so many headaches for scholars trying to establish a reliable text.
Why were they so unreliable?
Well, the folio editors themselves, Heminges and Condell, they referred to some of these earlier quartos as stolen and surreptitious copies. That's the term they used. These are what scholars later called the bad quartos. The thinking is they weren't based on Shakespeare's own manuscripts or official Playhouse prompt books. Instead, they were likely rough reconstructions.
How would they reconstruct them?
Possibly taken down by actors trying to remember their lines and cues, maybe even transcribed hastily by someone sitting in the audience during a performance. Imagine trying to reconstruct Hamlet purely from memory. The potential for errors, omissions, and just general garbling is immense.
So that means for some plays, we might have fundamentally conflicting versions.
Absolutely. King Lear is probably the most dramatic example. The 1608 quarto version and the 1623 folio version are so radically different in structure, the sequence of scenes, even the final fates of major characters, that modern editions like the Oxford Shakespeare actually feel compelled to print both versions separately.
Wow. So it suggests maybe Shakespeare was still revising his plays long after they were first performed, or the folio represents a later, more polished theatrical version.
It raises profound questions, doesn't it? What even is the intended or final version of a masterpiece when you have such variation? It's a constant challenge for editors and directors.
Okay, so the first folio gave us those basic classifications we still use: comedies, histories, and tragedies. But later criticism added more nuance, right?
Yes, those broad categories proved a bit too restrictive as critical analysis developed, especially in the 19th and 20th centuries. For instance, the critic Frederick S. Boas coined the term problem plays back in 1896.
Problem plays. What makes them a problem?
He used it to describe works like Measure for Measure or All's Well That Ends Well, plays whose overall temper or themes meant they couldn't be neatly pigeonholed as comedies. They contain dark, morally ambiguous, or disturbing elements that kind of resist a simple, happy, comedic resolution.
So the problem isn't really with the writing itself. It's more about the lack of a tidy moral or emotional ending.
Exactly. Measure for Measure, for instance, ends with a forced, rather uneasy marriage proposal, not genuine romantic joy. While Boas initially tried to classify Hamlet as a problem play too, it's now pretty definitively seen as a tragedy.
And there's another category for the ladle plays.
Yes. Edward Dowden later classified the final group of plays like The Tempest, The Winter's Tale, Cymbeline as romances, sometimes called tragic comedies.
Because they blend tragic elements with magic and happier endings.
Right. They often blend grave themes like loss, jealousy, and injustice with elements of the supernatural or improbable coincidences, but they ultimately move towards reconciliation and forgiveness. A very different feel from the bleakness of the great tragedies.
Okay, let's try and trace the evolution of his dramatic genius through these phases, starting with the early period, roughly 1589 to 1594.
This period is really dominated by his earliest histories, the three parts of Henry VI, Richard III, and his first attempts at comedy, like the Comedy of Errors or the Two Gentlemen of Verona.
And the style here is
Often highly conventional for the time, very rhetorical, lots of elaborate wordplay, clearly influenced by earlier Elizabethan dramatists like Marlowe, but also by medieval drama traditions and the bloody revenge tragedies of the Roman playwright Seneca.
and some of these earliest works. Well, they can present genuine ethical hurdles for modern audiences, can't they?
Oh, without a doubt. The Two Gentlemen of Verona, for instance, contains a scene near the end where one character seems to offer his beloved to his friend who just tried to rape her. It's deeply unsettling to modern sensibilities.
And the taming of the shrew.
Yes, with its focus on systematically breaking down a woman's independent spirit, is also frequently performed today only with significant reservations or radical reinterpretations to try and mitigate the misogyny.
But by the mid-1590s, we start to see a definite shift, right? Into that more complex, romantic atmosphere we really associate with his genius.
Absolutely. This is the era of the glorious romantic comedies. You get A Midsummer Night's Dream, which masterfully blends magical fairy realms with witty, confused human lovers.
And a huge development in character and language.
Yes, much more integration of complex characters, deeper psychology, and also incredibly rich prose comedy. This phase is really defined by the introduction of Sir John Falstaff in the Henry V plays.
One of the greatest comic creations in all of literature.
Absolutely. His sheer vitality, his wit, his amorality, he almost overwhelms the historical narrative he's part of.
And this period culminates dramatically, doesn't it? First with Romeo and Juliet around 1595.
The quintessential romantic tragedy, defined by youthful passion, feuding families, and that devastating ending. Pure, high romance and tragedy combined.
And then a few years later, around 1599, Julius Caesar, which feels different again.
It's a massive turning point. The literary critic James Shapiro really nailed it when he said that in Caesar, the various strands of politics, character, inwardness, contemporary events began to infuse each other.
So it's moving beyond just romance or history into political philosophy, inner turmoil.
Exactly. It's a drama focused on political dilemmas, conspiracy, betrayal, and the psychological weight of those choices. It really marks the transition to the absolute peak of his art, the great tragedies.
Okay, here we go. The period from roughly 1600 to about 1608. This is where it gets truly transformative, producing Hamlet, Othello, King Lear, and Macbeth. What's the key structural difference here separating these from what came before?
I think they moved decisively away from those more externalized Senecan revenge plots, though revenge is still present, obviously towards incredibly deep, internal, existential, psychological exploration.
Exploring the fatal flaw.
Yes, the core tragic structures are often built around the protagonist's fatal flaw, but executed with just breathtaking variation and depth. Consider the huge difference between the intensely introverted, intellectual Hamlet,
Whose fatal flaw is perhaps overthinking, indecision. That hesitation famously voiced in To Be or Not to Be.
precisely. Compare that to Othello or Lear. They are undone not by hesitation, but by a catastrophic, hasty error of judgment, impulsive action based on flawed perception.
Othello's flaw being his susceptibility to Iago's manipulation, his overwhelming sexual jealousy, leading him to murder the innocent Desdemona.
Right. And Lear's fatal error is that incredibly rash decision at the start, abandoning his power, demanding false declarations of love from his daughters, banishing the one who truly loves him, Cordelia, which unleashes just unspeakable suffering and cosmic chaos.
And Macbeth, how does that fit?
Macbeth, which is the shortest and maybe the most intensely compressed of the tragedies, is distinct again. It's driven not just by Macbeth's own ambition, but by that powerful external supernatural element, the witches and their prophecies combined with this incredibly vivid psychological depiction of guilt that eventually consumes both Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. The sheer poetic intensity in these plays is just unmatched.
Unbelievable. Okay, so after that peak, we reach his final phase, the romances or tragicomedies, from about 1608 to 1613. We mentioned Cymbeline, The Winter's Tale, The Tempest, and the collaborations fit in here too.
That's right. These plays definitely have a grave tone often. They feature separation, jealousy, tyranny, supposed deaths, profound loss. So they aren't light comedies.
Well, they end differently.
Ultimately, yes.
Yeah.
They resolve into themes of reconciliation, forgiveness, the restoration of lost children, often with a sense of wonder or magic. It's a clear move away from the nihilism or bleakness that permeates the great tragedies.
Was he also maybe responding to changing theatrical tastes?
Very likely. These plays also show Shakespeare reacting to the fashions of the Jacobean court, which increasingly favored elaborate staging and spectacle masks, music, special effects. In Cymbeline, for instance, you get stage directions calling for the god Jupiter to descend in thunder and lightning, sitting upon an eagle.
Wow. Very different from the stark stage of the earlier Globe.
Very different. More suited to the indoor Blackfriars Theater, perhaps. It shows him still adapting, still experimenting, right to the end of his solo career.
The plays obviously cemented his stage legacy. But his poetry, especially the narrative poems and the sonnets, they gave us a different view of his literary ambition, didn't they? And were written during specific circumstances.
That's right. They were primarily produced, or at least published, during those periods when the plague forced the London theaters to close. His two long narrative poems, Venus and Adonis, and The Rape of Lucrece, were published in 1593 and 1594, respectively.
And both were dedicated to the same person.
Yes, both dedicated to Henry Wriothesley, the third Earl of Southampton, a young, wealthy, and culturally influential nobleman who many believe was Shakespeare's patron during this period, possibly supporting him financially when the theaters were dark.
And these poems tackle quite strong, complex sexual themes, don't they?
They really do. Venus and Adonis explores the goddess Venus's aggressive, almost desperate pursuit of the beautiful but reluctant young Adonis. It deals with themes of desire, rejection, and maybe the destructive nature of obsessive love.
And The Rape of Lucrece.
That one is much darker, much more tragic. It graphically recounts the story from Roman history of the virtuous noblewoman Lucretia being raped by Tarquin. It explores uncontrolled lust, the violation of chastity, moral confusion, honor, and ultimately the profound psychological trauma of sexual violence leading to Lucrece's suicide.
These must have caused quite a stir.
They were literary blockbusters in their day. Hugely popular, reprinted multiple times. They really established Shakespeare as a major poet in his own right, separate from his work for the stage. Showed his versatility.
Okay, and then we have the sonnets. Published later in 1609, but probably written earlier.
That's the general belief, yes. The writer Francis Mears mentioned Shakespeare's Sugaret sonnets among his private friends way back in 1598. This suggests they were circulating in manuscript form for years, likely intended for a select private readership, not necessarily for publication.
And structurally, they fall into two famous contrasting sequences.
Broadly, yes. The first, larger sequence, Sonnets 1-126, is addressed to, or concerns, a beautiful and aristocratic young man, often referred to as the fair youth. The poems explore themes of love, beauty, time, mortality, and urging the young man to marry and have children to preserve his beauty.
And the second sequence,
Sonnets 127, 152 are addressed to or concern a woman often called the Dark Lady. She's depicted as being conventionally unattractive by Elizabethan standards, dark hair, dark eyes, dark complexion, possibly married, and the relationship described is often tormented, sensual, and filled with betrayal and self-loathing. The final two sonnets are adaptations of classical epigrams.
These sonnets are the source of just endless speculation, aren't they? Particularly about identity. With the I speaking in the poems meant to be Shakespeare himself, were the fair youth and dark lady real people?
That's the million-dollar question. We simply don't know for sure, and honestly, that ambiguity is a huge part of their enduring power and fascination. They feel intensely personal, yet they resist easy biographical decoding.
And the mystery is compounded by that strange dedication in the 1609 edition.
Oh, yes, the dedication to a mysterious Mr. W.H., who is described as the only begetter of the poems, who, as Mr. W.H. scholars, have proposed dozens of candidates. Henry Raisley, reversing the initials, William Herbert, Earl of Pembroke, even William Hall, the printer's assistant. Nobody knows for sure.
And we don't even know if Shakespeare authorized the publication.
No, it's quite likely they were published without his direct involvement or permission, possibly by the publisher Thomas Thorpe, who somehow got hold of a manuscript copy, another layer of mystery.
But what we do know is their immense critical impact.
Oh, absolutely. Regardless of the biographical riddles, they are universally praised as just a profound, intimate, and technically brilliant meditation on the great human concerns. Love in all its forms, passionate, platonic, obsessive, desire, beauty, procreation, betrayal, the destructive power of time, the search for immortality through poetry.
They contain some of the most famous lines in English poetry. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?
That's Sonnet 18, yeah. Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Their influence is just immeasurable.
But arguably, the real technical revolution, the innovation that truly defined modern English drama, lies in his mastery and manipulation of blank verse within the plays themselves.
Yes, I think that's right. His earliest style, as we sort of touched on, was often highly conventional, very rhetorical. If you look at early works like Titus Andronicus or even parts of Richard III, the sentences often end quite obediently right at the end of the 10-syllable line break.
Creating a very regular, maybe even monotonous rhythm.
It can feel that way sometimes, yes, almost end-stopped. The speeches can feel more like formal orations delivered line by line, rather than capturing the flow of natural thought or conversation.
So how did he break free from that? How did he transform that basic structure, unrhymed iambic pentameter, into something so dynamic and revolutionary?
Well, first he mastered it completely. He understood the underlying pulse of the iambic pentameter, that da-dum, 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 da-dum rhythm. And then, once he had that mastery, he started to intentionally, artfully break it.
How so?
He introduced run-on lines, what critics call enjambment, where the grammatical sense or phrase spills over the line break, forcing the reader or actor to continue without a pause. He varied the position of the caesura, the natural pause within the line. He used feminine endings, lines with an extra unstressed syllable. He incorporated irregular pauses, hesitations, interruptions, and elliptical constructions where words are deliberately omitted.
This sounds quite technical, maybe, but the impact on conveying psychology must be profound.
It is absolutely the difference between writing formal poetry and writing believable human speech. The constant variation, the deviation from the perfect metronomic beat, is what mimics the way human thought actually works, sometimes flowing, sometimes halting, sometimes rushed, sometimes contemplative, emotionally charged.
Can you give an example of where we really hear this?
Oh, all over the later plays, but Hamlet's introspection is a prime example. Think of that bit where he's describing his unease. Sir, in my heart there was a kind of fighting that would not let me sleep. See how fighting carries over? Then, methought I lay worse than the mutines and the bilboes, rashly, and praised be rashness for it. Let us know, our indiscretion sometimes serves us well. The pauses, the dashes, the run-ons, it perfectly mirrors his troubled, racing mind.
You can almost hear the character thinking, can't you? It's not just reporting thoughts, it is the thought process.
Exactly. This incredible ability to vary rhythm and integrate poetic genius with a deep, practical sense of how actors speak on stage allowed him to take existing plots, often borrowed pretty freely from sources like Plutarch's Lives for the Roman plays or Holinshed's Chronicles for the English histories, and completely reshape them.
He wasn't just translating the story to the stage.
No way. He created multiple centers of interest, complex subplots, ensured dynamic pacing, and most importantly, he elevated simple narrative or historical chronicle into profound psychological drama by letting us hear the characters think and feel through this incredibly flexible verse.
And he also used these incredibly vivid, concrete analogies that just stick in your mind, didn't he? Making the abstract tangible.
Yes. Think of that description of pity in Macbeth, the one the artist William Blake later illustrated so powerfully. And pity, like a naked newborn babe striding the blast or heaven's cherubim horsed upon the sightless couriers of the air. He makes an abstract concept like pity into this vulnerable, powerful, almost terrifying image. That's sheer genius, making the language work on multiple levels simultaneously.
So the legacy of this stylistic innovation, combined with the sheer depth of character and story, it secured his place not just in English literature, but as a foundational global cultural figure. It seems almost impossible to overstate his influence.
It really is essentially boundless. He fundamentally expanded the dramatic potential of both characterization and genre. Before Romeo and Juliet, for instance, romance wasn't really considered a weighty enough topic for high tragedy. He made it so.
And the soliloquy. He transformed that too.
Completely. He moved it way beyond just being a clumsy device to convey plot information to the audience. Now I must go and kill the king. He turned the soliloquy into this intimate, unparalleled window into a character's deepest psychological processes, their doubts, fears, motivations, their very consciousness.
And the impact just ripples outwards, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Through pretty much every other art form imaginable.
Oh, absolutely. Novelists from Herman Melville. I mean, Captain Ahab and Moby Dick is a classic Shakespearean tragic hero, clearly inspired by King Lear Macbeth through Charles Dickens, William Faulkner. They were all profoundly steeped in Shakespearean drama, character types, and plotting.
And music.
Film. Don't even get me started. There are literally tens of thousands of pieces of music linked to his works. Just think of Giuseppe Verdi's great operas, Macbeth, Othello, Falstaff, or Felix Mendelssohn's famous incidental music for A Midsummer Night's Dream. Sergei Prokofiev's iconic ballet score for Romeo and Juliet. It goes on and on.
And film adaptations are countless.
Countless, and not just direct adaptations. Think of the great Japanese filmmaker Akira Kurosawa, his masterpieces Throne of Blood, based on Macbeth, and Ran, based on King Lear. They prove that Shakespeare's core narratives are entirely universal, capable of transcending language, culture, and time.
Even Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, drew heavily on Shakespearean psychology, didn't he? Particularly Hamlet.
Yes, Freud used Hamlet extensively in developing his theories of the Oedipus complex and human nature. He saw Shakespeare as having an intuitive grasp of the unconscious mind long before psychoanalysis existed.
And then, of course, there's the language itself. He didn't just use English, he actively shaped it.
He literally forged the modern English lexicon in many ways. Samuel Johnson, when compiling his seminal Dictionary of the English Language in the mid-18th century, quoted Shakespeare more often than any other author by far, effectively canonizing his usage.
And so many everyday expressions we use without even thinking about it.
They come straight from Shakespeare, with bated breath. That's from The Merchant of Venice. A foregone conclusion, Othello. Break the ice, the taming of the shrew. All that glitters is not gold, though he wrote glisters. Merchant of Venice again. To be cruel, only to be kind. Hamlet. The list is endless. They've just become part of the fabric of the language.
Let's touch briefly on his critical reception over the centuries. Even in his own time, his genius was recognized, wasn't it? Despite Green's attack.
Yes, fairly early on. Francis Meres, writing in 1598 in a survey of English writers called Palladis Tamia, called Shakespeare most excellent in both comedy and tragedy, comparing him favorably to classical authors like Plautus and Seneca.
And Ben Jonson, his friend and rival, gave the ultimate verdict.
He did. Despite their professional rivalry and Johnson's own more classical leanings, he wrote that amazing commendatory verse preface to the first folio, famously declaring Shakespeare was not of an age, but for all time. That really set the tone for centuries to come.
But his reputation wasn't always universally sky-high and unquestioned.
No, it fluctuated a bit. During the Restoration period in the later 17th century, neoclassical critics like Thomas Reimer actually rated him below Jonson and Fletcher, finding his work too wild, too irregular, violating the classical rules of drama.
Who defended him then?
It was the great poet and critic John Dryden who offered the most powerful rebuttal. Dryden famously stated that while he admired Jonson, he loved Shakespeare. He argued that Shakespeare possessed a kind of natural learning, a genius that transcended rigid rules.
And then the Victorians maybe went too far the other way.
You could say that. The Victorian era saw such intense, almost uncritical worship of Shakespeare, what George Bernard Shaw famously mocked as bardolatry, that it provoked a reaction.
Shaw himself was quite critical, wasn't he?
Very witty and provocative in his critiques, yes. But then modernist writers like T.S. Eliot in the early 20th century sort of rediscovered Shakespeare, embracing his complexity, his ambiguity, even his perceived primitiveness, finding it spoke powerfully to the modern condition. His relevance just keeps getting reaffirmed for every new generation.
Okay. For all this established genius, this monumental legacy, we absolutely have to acknowledge the controversies and the unresolved speculations that continue to generate passionate interest and sometimes heated debate, even today.
We do, and let's address the most famous, most persistent one first, the authorship question.
Right, the idea that William Shakespeare of Stratford didn't actually write the plays and poems attributed to him.
Exactly. These doubts arose relatively late, actually not really gaining traction until the mid-19th century, about 230 years after his death. They were largely fueled by the perceived gaps in his biographical record and a kind of snobbery, frankly.
Snobbery about his education and social class.
Largely, yes. The argument often boils down to, how could a mere grammar school-educated man from the provinces, the son of a glover, possibly possess the vast knowledge of law, history, foreign languages, court life, philosophy, falconry, etc., that is displayed so dazzlingly in the plays?
So, who are the main alternative candidates proposed? We should probably name the big ones while stressing the mainstream view.
Absolutely. It's crucial to state upfront that the overwhelming consensus among literary historians and Shakespeare scholars, based on the surviving contemporary documentary evidence, theater records, payments, witness accounts, the folio preface, his Stratford monument, is that William Shakespeare of Stratford did write the works. However,
the alternative theories persist. Who's candidate number one, usually? Francis Bacon.
Sir Francis Bacon is often the earliest prominent candidate. He was a renowned philosopher, scientist, lawyer, courtier, and statesman, undeniably a man of vast intellect and learning. Proponents argue he had the necessary knowledge and perhaps used sophisticated ciphers hidden within the text to conceal his authorship, maybe because playwriting was seen as a slightly disreputable activity for a man of his public standing.
Okay. Candidate number two, Christopher Marlowe.
Marlowe makes sense in some ways because he was Shakespeare's chief rival in the early 1590s, a brilliant university wit, an established poet and playwright of genius, Chamberlain, Dr. Faustus. The issue is, Marlowe officially died in a supposed tavern brawl in Deptford in 1593, just as Shakespeare's career was really taken off.
So the theory requires his death to have been faked.
Yes. Marlowe enthusiasts often subscribe to the idea that his death was staged, perhaps due to his alleged activities as a government spy, allowing him to continue writing in secret under the convenient cover of Shakespeare's name. The stylistic similarities between Marlowe and early Shakespeare are also sometimes cited.
And finally, the candidate who seems most popular among skeptics today, Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford.
De Vere has become the leading alternative candidate for many. The Oxfordian theory suggests that de Vere, a highly educated, traveled aristocrat with known literary interests, intimate knowledge of court life, Italy, falconry, music, all things reflected prominently in the plays, was the true author.
And the argument is he needed a frontman.
Yes, that aristocratic disdain for print publication, especially for the popular stage, meant he needed a commoner, Shakespeare, to act as a plausible front for his work. Supporters point to parallels between de Vere's life events and incidents in the plays.
It's essential, though, to reiterate.
Absolutely essential. While these theories are fascinating and keep generating books and documentaries, almost all mainstream Shakespeare scholars and literary historians regard the authorship question as a fringe theory, lacking any substantive contemporary documentation to overturn the wealth of evidence pointing to William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon.
It seems to be a question driven more by a romantic dissatisfaction with the surviving records and maybe some class bias rather than by compelling evidence.
I think that's a fair assessment, yes. The historical evidence for Shakespeare's authorship is consistent and cumulative, even if it's not as detailed as we might wish.
Okay, let's move to another area of speculation. His private religious beliefs. This was a time of huge religious turmoil in England, wasn't it? Catholics versus Protestants.
Intense turmoil and persecution, particularly for Catholics. And the evidence around Shakespeare is typically contradictory and ambiguous. We know his mother, Mary Arden, came from a prominent Warwickshire family with known Catholic sympathies who maintained recusant connections, meaning they refused to attend Anglican services.
And his father, too. There was that document.
Yes, there's evidence, though the document itself is now lost, suggesting his father, John Shakespeare, may have signed a kind of secret Catholic statement of faith late in his life. Furthermore, some scholars find subtle pro-Catholic sentiments or coded language woven into the plays, particularly around themes of martyrdom, old faith rituals, or purgatory, which was a Catholic doctrine.
But what's the evidence for his Protestant conformity? Because officially, he lived and died an Anglican.
The official records are clear on that front. He was baptized, married, and buried in the Protestant Church of England. His children were raised Anglican. His will uses standard Protestant preamble language. His company, the King's Men, performed frequently before the staunchly Protestant monarch James I.
So, impossible to definitively nail down his private beliefs.
Pretty much impossible. Scholars find evidence pointing both ways. It seems most likely he conformed publicly to the established church, as was legally required and practically necessary for his career. But his family background and the nuanced treatment of religious themes in his plays suggest he was certainly deeply aware of, and perhaps sympathetic to, the Catholic predicament. The plays themselves are generally ambiguous enough to speak across the religious divide, which might have been intentional.
Another key area, endless speculation. His sexuality, fueled almost entirely by those sonnets we discussed.
Almost entirely, yes. The sonnets are the primary source text for this debate. The intense, passionate, sometimes anguished language used in the sequence addressed to the fair youth leads some readers to interpret this as clear evidence of romantic, possibly erotic, love for a young man.
But that's not the only way to read that language.
No. Other critics argue forcefully that this kind of intense, effusive language was characteristic of idealized Platonic male friendship during the Renaissance, and doesn't necessarily imply a physical or sexual relationship in the modern sense. They emphasize the cultural context of the time.
And meanwhile, you have the Dark Lady sonnets.
Exactly. The 26 sonnets addressed to the mysterious Dark Lady are often cited as undeniable evidence of intense, physical, and often deeply troubled heterosexual liaisons. The language there is explicitly sexual, full of desire, guilt, and betrayal.
So the texts themselves support a range of interpretations.
They really do. You can find evidence in the sonnets to support arguments for same-sex desire, passionate heterosexual relationships, or perhaps complex emotional states that don't fit neatly into modern categories. Ultimately, the sonnets reflect the complexity and contradictions of human love and desire, rather than providing a clear biographical statement about Shakespeare's personal orientation.
Which, again, leaves room for endless interpretation. Finally, what about the most basic thing? What did the man actually look like? We still don't have a definitive contemporary written description of his appearance, do we?
Isn't that amazing? For arguably the most famous person of his era, no contemporary description survives, saying if he was tall or short, fair or dark, thin or stout. Nothing.
So we rely primarily on just two key images, both created just after his death.
That's right. The first and arguably most important is the Droeshout engraving. This is the portrait printed on the title page of the first folio in 1623.
And Ben Jonson vouched for it.
He did. In his poem printed alongside it in the folio, Jonson explicitly praised the engraver, Martin Droeshout, for hitting his face accurately. That endorsement from someone who knew Shakespeare well gives it immense credibility, even if stylistically it looks a bit stiff to us now.
And the second key image
is his funerary monument, the sculpted bust erected in Holy Trinity Church in Stratford, likely commissioned by his family fairly soon after his death, probably before 1623. It shows a rather prosperous, slightly plump man, quill in hand. Again, presumably approved by those who knew what he looked like.
But what about the most famous painting often associated with him, the Chandos portrait?
Ah, the Chandos portrait. It's now held by the National Portrait Gallery in London, and it certainly looks more like our romantic image of a poet earring, slightly disheveled look. It has, as one expert put it, the strongest claim of any of the known contenders to be a genuine portrait of Shakespeare painted from life.
Based on what?
Based on its plausible dating to the early 17th century and its provenance, which can potentially be traced back through owners who had connections to Shakespeare's circle. However, its attribution is not definitively proven, and it's not without its own controversies and questions.
So even his face remains slightly elusive.
Like so much else about the man himself. No portrait was definitively commissioned by him or his immediate family while he was alive, and clearly labeled as him, which is just another one of those fascinating biographical gaps surrounding the world's most famous writer. #outro.
So what does this all mean for us, trying to understand Shakespeare today? We've traced this astonishing trajectory, haven't we? From the son of a Stratford Glover whose own life seemed to start in a bit of haste,
to becoming a London theater sharer, a shrewd businessman who achieved revolutionary wealth and status through his stake in the company.
We've seen that incredible evolution of his literary output from those early, often conventional histories and comedies through the glorious Romantic period, peaking with those monumental psychological tragedies.
And then ending with those strange, beautiful, reconciling romances. All of it driven by that absolute mastery of blank verse that bent the English language to his will and essentially created modern dramatic speech.
And this trajectory, this output, produced an undeniable, almost overwhelming impact, not just on literature and drama, but on the very texture of global culture, on our language, on how we understand ourselves.
We know him, in essence, through his texts. They are the most detailed, the most intimate records we really have of his inner life, his concerns, his genius.
But maybe it's precisely the gaps in the records of the man, those long, lost years, the contradictory hints about his inner religious or sexual beliefs, the slightly opaque nature of his business dealings, and even his appearance, perhaps. It's those blank spaces that actually allow his art to feel so perpetually relevant, so universal.
That's a really interesting point because those gaps allow every generation, every culture, every individual reader or audience member to sort of project their own concerns, their own struggles onto the creator, finding echoes of themselves in the work precisely because the author himself remains slightly out of focus.
Indeed. And the one thing we can definitively say about the Bard, ironically, is that he spent his entire career giving his characters from Hamlet to Juliet to Lear to Rosalind clearer and more varied motivations, as Samuel Johnson noted, than any writer before him. He showed us the inner workings of the human heart.
Yet history, or just the random survival of documents, ultimately failed to grant those same clear motivations, that same transparency, to Shakespeare himself.
Which leaves us perhaps with this final provocative thought for you to ponder. What does it truly mean that the writer who arguably defined human inwardness for the modern world, who gave us the very language to describe the troubled soul, existential doubt, the complexities of love and jealousy remains in his own person, so profoundly opaque, so resistant to easy understanding, even after centuries of intense scrutiny? That is the deep dive for today.